This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 80. Welcome to the 80th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from FertilityFriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, then you already know just how passionate I am about connecting you with the tools and information that you need to improve your menstrual cycle health and your fertility. That's why I started the podcast in the first place, because I believe that every woman has a right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works, and I feel so privileged to be able to share my passion for body literacy and fertility awareness with you every single week. Fertility awareness is so much more than just birth control or trying to get pregnant, because it truly gives you a window into your own health and fertility, and I love sharing my expertise with clients and helping them to understand their charts and connect with their cycles. So if you've recently discovered fertility awareness but you're not feeling confident about using it for birth control just yet, or if you've been charting for a while and your cycles are all over the place and you can't figure out what's going on with your mucus and your cervix, and maybe you're having some random bleeding or spotting, I can help. Get started today with a free 15-minute consultation with me by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/coaching, or just click the work with me button on my website. I can't wait to delve in with you and get started. And I would also like to invite you to sign up for the Fertility Friday newsletter. Just head over to fertilityfriday.com/ebook, and as a gift to you, you'll receive a free copy of my new ebook where I reveal what to expect when coming off of hormonal contraceptives, and I share 5 steps to restoring healthy menstrual cycles post-pill. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Dr. Lee Baucom. Dr. Baucom is internationally known for his methods and approaches to saving marriages. For over 25 years, Dr. Baucom has been helping people around the world to save, restore, and create the relationships they desire and deserve. He's the author of the book, How to Save Your Marriage in 3 Simple Steps, and creator of the Save the Marriage system, as well as numerous other resources. Dr. Baucom also has a podcast, the Save the Marriage podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts on relationships and marriage. And on today's show, we'll be talking about fertility challenges and how they can impact a relationship, why some couples don't survive fertility challenges, and what you can do to strengthen your relationship so that fertility challenges don't destroy your relationship if you're faced with them. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Dr. Baucom.
Thank you, Lisa. And just go. Let's go with Lee.
Okay, that's a lot easier. Less of a mouthful for me.
Yeah.
Well, I've been listening to your podcast for a while, and I would love to hear about how you got started in the field of marriage counseling.
That's that's a long story. There are 2 different levels. One is I knew I wanted to work with families, marriages and families. And I really love the systems approach where you look at how everything is related rather than kind of that individual approach. I got a lot of training in individual also, but I think one of the things that has always stood out for me is watching groups and how they interact. And so that was my initial interest. When I started training, I noticed that I kind of gravitated towards helping couples. And part of that is just kind of looking at my own family of origin. My parents are happily married, and there are some in our family that are happily married. And then I have a couple, they throw off the whole national average. So they've been divorced so many times that several other families don't have to mess with that because my relatives have taken care of that. And I watch what happened to their kids and just the destructive nature of destructive marriage patterns. And so that was my initial training. The next piece of that, though, which is what led to my breaking off and the writing I've done and the work I've done, is a lot of people don't realize that traditional marriage therapy doesn't have the best results. And so part of my next step was to say, okay, if traditional therapy doesn't really do a good job, what could help couples? And so that was kind of what birthed the first I wrote the Save the Marriage, which became Save the Marriage System. And then later wrote the book you mentioned, How to Save Your Marriage in 3 Simple Steps. And my podcast tends to also represent some of my thoughts around those same issues.
Well, I'm really excited to delve into your perspective on infertility, because I know that's a really specific topic that you don't always focus on your podcast. And before we get into it, I would love for you to share with the listeners what your philosophy is on marriage and why people do get divorced, why people don't make it.
Those are 2 very different questions. So let me see if I can tackle the first. And then, so my philosophy, Well, so let's start with my concerns. There's a lot of times people have been led to believe that their central issue is communication, and so we watch people go to therapy, and I had it for a lot of time. People would come in and say, we need help with our communication. And so I would sit there and I would talk with them for 40 minutes or so, and I would say, what's interesting, you asked for this help on communication, and I've heard every word you said, and I understood every word you said, and it seemed very clear that each of you understand each other. So the question is not about communication. And so one of the places where I think traditional therapy is kind of defaulted to the easy answer of, oh, it's communication. I do think there is a C involved. It's just not communication. It's about connection. And so that's what I've been trying to work on. Yes, communication does help connection, but the bigger issue behind connection is perception, the perceptions we have of each other that does filter the communication. And so a lot of times people come to me and they've gone to a therapist somewhere and they've learned the I statements, I feel blah, blah, blah when you blah, 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 and I wish you would blah, blah, blah. And that's a way of breaking up the pattern of when somebody says, you're a jerk, you whatever. And the problem is it's a nice communication trick for about the first 5 times you do it. And then after that, as soon as you say, I feel, what the spouse hears is, you're a jerk and blah, blah, blah. And so, we're right back to this perceptions that we've created that are poisoned. And so if you step one back, what poisoned the perception? Usually it's a lack of connection. And that's where a lot of my work has been of how do you, why is connection so important would be the first piece. But then how do you restore that connection because it is so important? I just believe that humans are, we are in a group of creatures that like each other. The mammalian species like each other, but we have one step beyond that where we can think in words. And so then we have these words about connection and how we get towards connection with words and actions. And so that tends to kind of mix things up a little bit. The big piece that I've realized is, so let me say, if I go back to my book, How to Save Your Marriage in 3 Simple Steps, first, I always have to give the little caveat that when I said simple, I didn't say easy, right? So there's a big difference. It's a very direct approach, but that doesn't mean it's an easy approach because it really does require something. So just to kind of shortcut that, the 3 C's that I talk about in the 3 simple steps, the first C is connection. A lot of times couples have derailed their connection, and we're going to talk about one of those reasons that they've derailed that connection as they've gotten hooked into the infertility issues and all that comes around that. But sometimes it's, after kids, a lot of couples think they hit the pause button, and so they're focusing on kids and they're doing that whole frame of life, and relationships don't have a pause button. And so the connection has waned. And in my belief, a connection is either growing and building or it's declining and fragmenting. That's the only 2 ways connections go. They don't ever stay stagnant. And then there's us. So that's the connection between a couple. And then there's the individual. And so the second C is changing yourself. And I always want to be very clear that when I'm saying change yourself, I'm not saying you're broken. There's something pathological with you. There's something wrong with you, as much as we all have places where we need to change and grow. And marriage is one of the places where we tend to stop changing and growing. We get stagnant and we get stuck. And so part of what's happened is that we haven't nurtured the connection. And part of what's happened is we haven't nurtured the change in ourselves. And that brings us to that third C, which is to create a new path. My basic theory is that marriage is about building a we, where we are in this together. We're a team. We've got each other's back. And if a couple doesn't know that that's the task, they get lost and they wander along bunches of other paths that don't get them there. And so they've got to create a new path. And for me, a piece of that is just a lack of understanding. People don't realize that really is the goal of a marriage. And if you don't realize it, you don't even know to aim for it. But once you know that's the aim, then the question is how you get there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we'll get to some of I think you kind of outlined you're kind of giving us a kind of an overview, and then it kind of gets to why people get divorced. But I think we'll get into that a bit. But maybe we could delve into the infertility issue. So in your years of experience working with clients, if a couple is struggling with infertility, maybe you could talk about some of the particular challenges that come with that particular issue.
Yes, and they are both relational and individual. And this isn't going to be any surprise, but sometimes it's helpful to hear that, gosh, that's not just me that's going through this, or not just us that's going through this. This is a common occurrence. And I think one big one is the shame guilt piece. And the shame comes from the fact that we expect our bodies to do what we want them to do, and especially when we're young. And so in those childbearing years, you just think your body is supposed to listen to you and do what you want it to do. And we've been brought up in a culture that says that you should be able to procreate. And so sometimes there's some shame that, there's something wrong with you, that that somehow you're defective, and all of those other messages that we take in, or people take in. So that's the shame. The guilt sometimes is, am I doing enough? Am I doing too much? Am I taking away from the relationship? And so there's a guilt about the focus. And so then also, I think a big piece of this is the fact that very well-meaning people accidentally say very mean things, not knowing it. And so you can't escape it. You go to a party and somebody says, "Oh, when you're going to have your child, or when you're having your next child," and so it becomes a constant reminder. And you're in a social setting with family, with friends. You go to the mall and there's the baby brigade, and it's just kind of surrounding you, and that keeps it as an open wound. So those are the pieces I think are the individual pieces that we drag in. As a couple, sometimes couples aren't they might be even in the same chapter, but they may not be on the same page about what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And so there's a friction because they aren't really trying to get to a place of how do we want to deal with this. It often gets to that, I want to do this and you want to do that, and we're now opposed. And so that does kind of get back to that fundamental question about marriage. If you're not working towards building a we, you're usually staying in that you and me kind of phase where every relationship starts. It's you and me. But the problem in a marriage is if it doesn't become we, it becomes you versus me. And that really is when there's an infertility issue and a question of how do we proceed from here, it's that you versus me really shows itself in some very painful ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like one of the episodes you touched on something about compromise. And so there's a lot of things in life that you can compromise on, but a child is not one of them.
Yes.
So hopefully when you're in a relationship, before you choose to move to that next step, you would have some sort of conversation about, do I want children or not? So if one person wants children and the other person doesn't, I don't know how you would reconcile that. But then there's this other level where when you get in the relationship, you both might have wanted children, but maybe one individual is willing to do anything to make it happen, and the other individual will get to a point where they're ready to stop trying. Mm-hmm. So how would a couple reconcile that type of difference?
Okay, so let's talk kind of in a philosophy of this, that if they're saying, okay, we're a team here, we're a unit, and so every time we move forward, we move as a team, as a unit. And that doesn't mean it's lockstep, and it doesn't mean everybody's in agreement, but you get to an agreement before the next step. I've led some groups overseas on nonprofit kind of programs, and my first rule when I'm talking with a team is we move as a team. And that doesn't mean that everybody on the team is ready to move. And we're not a tight, it's not like we're all stitched together, but we're going to move as a team, and we're going to watch out for each other. And if somebody is not ready to move on, we pause there and figure out what needs to happen. And so That's that's a good mindset, right? It doesn't answer your question in particulars, but it's a mindset of we are moving forward as a team because we're in this together. And so you're talking about a conflict point that I think is an important one. The When I talk about being a we, I'm not talking about. I remember a term we used in systems theory of an undifferentiated ego mass. Just a mess here of a glob of people, and that's not what I'm talking about. That's almost the opposite of what I'm talking about. When you have two people who are bringing their best selves to the relationship and joining together, that's a we. It's not about giving up your own identity. It's about realizing that the identity expands, that there's something greater between the two of you and you have each other's back. So I'd use that as a preemptor to this. Now you get to the question of fertility, and let me back up one more step and say that when I do premarital counseling, that is one of my big questions. Have you talked about having kids? Because if one of you says, I do not want kids, and the other says, I definitely want kids, and neither one is willing to move the other way, to me, that is not the time to say, well, then let's get married. That's got to be solved because somebody is going to be very unhappy in the relationship. Now that assumes that anybody has control over, whether they're going to get pregnant or not, and that's always the unknown. But that's the starting point. So I assume that, and I hope that people, when they enter into a marriage, have already had that conversation and have already realized the kind of the minefields around that. Then you have the questions of when do we get pregnant, and what do we do, if that's not working, and so those are both extra tension points because we're always living, I believe we're always living in where we are right now. And we can plan some for the future, but there are so many of those unknowns. And so a couple might get married, ready to start their marriage in a year. And in a year, nothing happens, right? There's no progress on that. They're not in terms of getting pregnant. Or one of them says, wait a minute, we're not ready for a child. The finances have fallen apart. The schooling thing's up in the air. Something has stalled it out. And that to me is the beginning point of the negotiation anyway, of saying, okay, well, what practically makes sense? And that's the same question every step of the way. What practically makes sense to us, and what is the us part of it? Not what do I want, but how does this represent us together? And so that's always for me a starting point for the negotiation. I did mediation training a number of years back, and I remember the number one rule was everybody has some common thing that they want. And it may be very abstract for people who are coming, opposite ends, but they have something in common that they want. And so for a couple, that's always the beginning point of what is our commonality? Where is our joining point? And usually for a couple, it's a pretty big place. But that's if they start from what do we agree on, what do we use as our basis, then it's a lot easier to talk about the things that are the stuck points.
Mm-hmm. I think that is a really interesting and powerful philosophy, to think of yourself as an overarching team and then, moving forward. But then if one person, I feel like that's such a great analogy for what happens in these situations, because you get to a point where one person isn't ready to move forward. And then this presents kind of a really great paradigm of how to address that together, instead of it becoming this me versus you. But one of the topics that I've talked a little bit about, because I've touched on this infertility topic in a few different episodes that I've done, and one of the things that has come out are the different ways that men and women often deal with infertility. Whereas, there's no broad generalization, but some couples might find that the female part of the couple is really wanting to continue, whether it's fertility treatments or whatever the case is, until the bitter end, quote unquote. Whereas the male in the couple might still really want a child, but he sees the devastating impact that it's having on his female partner. And then that kind of causes him to want to jump ship, not necessarily because he doesn't want a baby, but because he's looking out for his spouse. So have you found that men and women deal with infertility challenges differently, generally speaking?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's always a danger in overgeneralizing, but generally speaking, I think you're right that there is a different level of let's go for it with men and women, and what that entails. And I think that sometimes it's hard to be I want to be very sensitive to gender stuff because both men and women can have equal desire to have a child, and so I want to represent that. But I do think that the societal messages are still more heavily laden towards women, and um, when I watch even kids, young kids, boys aren't generally drawing pictures of them grown up with kids. They're drawing pictures of other things, other activities they're going to be involved in, and so I think there's still some of that embedded. It's not fantasy, but dream kind of life that your ideal life that you're thinking about still is that women feel that more pressure about being able to procreate and than men, and I think a lot of times those subtle messages from childhood do come back to haunt a couple that's struggling with that. And there's also the question of how a couple deals with grief, and there is certainly grief around infertility, and a lot of times there's some resentment on one side or the other about the other person being at a different place of grief. And why aren't they grieving like I'm grieving? Because I'm grieving right. That's the subtext. Instead of recognizing that people grieve differently, and you don't being a we doesn't mean you're lockstep in where you are in that grief, as much as can you recognize that the other person is going to be at a different stage of grief, and that be okay. And so I see a lot of times where the battle lines are drawn, gender wise and around grief stages.
Hmm. I feel like that really puts it into really interesting perspective in terms of thinking about it as a different stage of grief. So instead of thinking that your partner is this insensitive jerk, it could really help you to understand that your partner might be dealing with the grief in a totally different way and not expressing it the same, but it doesn't mean that they don't have the same level and intensity of feeling that you have.
Yeah, just being at a different place and what is triggered, what that grief is about, can be very different, and to allow room for that. But I do think that there are some very broad generalizations that we might make that men tend to be fixers, and if they see a spouse in pain, they want to get that spouse out of pain.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they might choose a different approach. So the spouse in pain who wants to have a child sees the solution as continuing to go for it, to continuing to find whatever hope there is. And the spouse who wants that spouse out of pain may see the solution as it's time to stop. There's been already too much pain.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I want to touch on again, so you talked about communication, and I think that that is a definite big, huge misconception, that the reason that we're fighting is because we're not communicating properly, which generally means that like you're not listening to me or you're not agreeing with everything I say or something like that, in my opinion. But what happens for couples that find themselves having kind of that same fight over and over again? Because you kind of, if you're struggling with this and you're not seeing eye to eye, then you probably have kind of the same fight over and over again. It's not like it's a different fight. It's the same one.
Yep.
So one of the things that you talked about, one of your 3 C's is change. And I know in your podcast, you always talk about changing yourself. How would you, I guess, counsel a couple who's facing that same fight over and over again with regards to infertility, and how can they kind of get out of that negative space?
So that's not a uniquely infertility issue. One of the things that I always like to do when people come into my office is when I say found to be effective is probably a better way of phrasing that than I like to pick a fight in my office, but that was what I was doing. And I would say, so tell me about the first fight you ever had. Not the first little disagreement where, one of you wanted Chinese and the other wanted, Japanese, or one wanted to go to a romance comedy and the other wanted to go to an action movie. Those aren't the ones I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ones that stop you in your tracks and go, wait a minute, what have I done? What is this all about? And so they'll tell me that fight. And if I've seen them long enough, I can tell them why their current fight is the exact same fight that they had back then. They never solved it. And so I think a lot of times the topic can change, the focus of that can change, but it's the exact same issue that keeps coming up. And sometimes even the content is the same, but a lot of times they'll put some particular content to rest and it emerges somewhere else. And so sometimes those struggles need to be seen from a 30,000-foot view and go, wait, how is this about our relationship, not about this particular topic? And sometimes that helps people to break the hold that topic has on them, that issue has, when they go, oh, wait, we keep having this. We've got to finally really solve this issue, or it's going to keep coming up, whether it's infertility or child rearing or whatever else. Something else is going to be the hook, and it's going to be the exact same fight, just a different makeup.
Well, I remember before I got married, one of my girlfriends was talking about this great book, and I forget what it's called. It's under my bed still, probably. But, oh no, I do remember. It was the 10 conversations to have before marriage. So an interesting question would be do you think you can talk all this stuff out before and solve it all first, which is obviously not the case. But it really gave that impression that if you follow these rules of fair fighting and if you kind of talk about everything first, then you'll just have this even sailing relationship for the rest of your lives. So that's not how it works.
No.
So I guess in terms of and actually I read a book and it was talking about fighting and how I really should write these things down because I don't remember the name of that book either. But he talked about fighting. That was kind of the book was about fighting and how happy couples do fight, but they fight differently. And how everyone has these issues that you're talking about or arguments, say, for example, that you kind of keep hashing throughout your lives. But the couples that kind of were happy in the end kind of handled it differently. They didn't fight maybe as meanly, if that's a word, meanly. Maybe you could just touch on the difference. So because infertility struggle, however that looks, whether it's, IVF treatments or whether it's, not being able to conceive and then considering adoption and having the stresses that are involved in that, or even, repeated miscarriages. A lot of my listeners, even if it's just that it took a lot longer than you thought it would to get pregnant, or you're experiencing different challenges, for what would you say is the difference, if you could say that, between couples who go through those challenges and are able to maintain their relationship and keep it strong even with these challenges versus couples who go through these challenges and then their relationship falls apart?
So let me back up for a minute to your initial thing about the conversations to have before you get married. Here's why that's problematic. There is a psychological shift that happens in marriage that cannot happen before that. And that's the molding together or the resistance to the molding together of being a we. I believe that it just can't happen until you have said publicly, privately, whatever, I promise, and you lay out all the days that you would continue. And if you think about those vows, they're pretty powerful. If you think about what days are left, if you're going to stay together in sick days and in healthy days, in poor days and in rich days, in good days and in bad days, what is left of life if you cover that? So you're basically saying for every day, no matter what's going on, no matter what happens, we're going to be in this together, and I promise that. And I'm going to keep everybody else away. That's basically, boil it down, that's the wedding vows. And that's a pretty powerful commitment to make. And so the problem is that people think that they can come at this from a very rational place. So I'll just have these conversations, we'll put it to rest, and then we're good to go. And what they miss is that shift. And when that shift happens, we either fight it or we grow into it. That really is the problem. A lot of people go, wait, what is this thing? I'm going to lose myself to the relationship. I don't want to lose myself to the relationship. And so they fight it. And then some have the good fortune of going, oh, we're just moving into this new phase where we're a team and and we grow into that. So if that place doesn't join, then it is usually fair to say that the couple is fighting, because when it's you versus me, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. And that's a different approach than saying, we're in this together, we're in it for good. So what we're doing is trying to figure out how we want to live our lives. It's a conversation about the topics. It's not I'm going to prove you wrong and me right. Although sometimes that's a temptation to fall into, and everybody does. But it's not about, do I win? It's, where are we trying to get to? What's our overall piece? And so that's the kind of the background I use for anything. And then infertility, and what do we do about this topic, is just not, and I'm not minimizing it, but it's another one of those big life things that we've just got to work through together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the reality of it. I'm thinking of, so one of the guests that I had on recently, his name is Sheridan Voisey, and he was sharing his experience. Him and his wife struggled with fertility challenges for 10 years. And at which point, after they kind of got to their end point, they both decided that that was it. So he wrote a book about his experience and he shared it. But in the end, they didn't actually have a child. And he shared about, they went to a counselor, when they were going through the IVF treatments, and the counselor asked them if they had, just about their relationship. And he and his wife both said, the most important thing is our relationship. That's more important than a baby. And the counselor said something along the lines of, well, I'm glad to hear that, because the last couple that I had in my office actually said, I think it was the wife that said, if we don't have a baby, this marriage is over, type of thing. Mm-hmm. So maybe part of it is having that clarity and perspective that you are in this together, as you've said.
Yeah. For me, and this is, it's really a big piece, but for me, whatever happens, the primary relationship in that family is always the couple. Whether there are kids or no kids, it's always the couple. And so decisions are made based on that primary relationship. That's true before kids, and that's true after kids. But there's not just before and after, there's, and no kids. If that's just what comes, then that's true then too, that the primary piece for me is that relationship.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's, you mentioned something in the beginning about if you don't know what the path is, then you don't necessarily even plan for it. And so if you have that in your mind that, the relationship is important and it's the kind of the foundation, then it really does put things into perspective. It doesn't mean it's not going to be challenging, but I think to have that perspective would make a really big difference. And to switch gears a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sex part of this equation, because when we're talking about fertility challenges, sex is involved, but it can become less of a fun, intimate
it's a function
experience. Yeah. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that piece of it and how couples have dealt with the challenges that come with having to have sex on demand based on a schedule, and just how unsexy IVF is. I've had friends that have gone through IVF, and, your partner's in the bathroom, ejaculating into a cup, and there's like all kinds of stuff, testing going on. That's absolutely the most unsexy way to have a child. So you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah. And so, I would say that there is sex has lots of dynamics to it. And, so let's go back to where we'll put it into a context, and then we'll spin it out to infertility. One of the places when people would come to me and say we were having problems with sex, almost always what they were going to end up with was problems with connection. And problems about being a we, because almost always when a couple focuses on what am I getting, what am I not getting, how we doing this, and is it the way I want it? Am I getting it as often or how I want it? That's a question. And yet, if you say, okay, marriage is about being a we, there is no more physically clear way of being a we than having sex. And so I believe that sex certainly should be fun and enjoyable for both people. Absolutely. But there is a place of being able to switch gears and say, and it's about being a we. This is one of those places where we are in this together. And so when a couple is struggling around sex, forget infertility, but just around sex, often it's because it is that they're not at that place of being a we. That's one of their struggle points. So now we bring it into infertility, where there are times when it's just the hour struck, and the clock goes off, and the app or whatever they're using to track things says now. And for both people to be able to be on board with this is different. It still is a we, because we are trying to have that child, but this is just a subset. This is a piece that we recognize as part of the game. So that's a piece of it. And a second piece is making sure that they haven't made it their life to only be that way. And that's one of the breakdowns I see is it's not that couples have to, they have to perform on schedule, but that they only get into that habit. And so there is no intimacy happening other places. They become functional. The one is a donor and the other is a receiver. And that's all the role that they're going to play. They don't see the lover part. They don't see the intimacy part. And so then they've lost track of the couple part, the we part, and they've made themselves functionals. So one of my suggestions for couples is not that there's no way you can avoid that. Got to perform, got it, now's the hour. But can you balance that with the other? Can you stay intimate? Can you nurture the intimacy in the rest of your life? Can you find other ways of making sure you maintain that intimacy connection? And that helps bridge the gaps of when you have to have the functional part.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that draws into one of the topics that I wanted to talk with you about, because last year I read the book, The 5 Love Languages, by Dr. Gary Chapman, and you did have him on your podcast, and that was a great episode. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the 5 love languages. I feel like that concept of the different ways that we experience love and just the different facets of it can be helpful, especially if you're feeling disconnected from your partner, because as you said, to maintain the intimacy, but that doesn't necessarily mean only sexually.
Right. Well, yes and no. So Gary has this very, I told him his concept was elegantly simple, and that's why I liked it, and that's why I've connected with him. And the elegant simpleness of it is that we talk five different languages of love. And so using that idea of a language, you speak differently. And so, if I go, and this is true story, I have enough Spanish knowledge to get in trouble. That's all. But I'll go to this Spanish or this Mexican restaurant I like, and I'll order in Spanish. But I always know that if I say, how are you doing in Spanish, that they're going to answer me in Spanish, and I'm out of my league. I'm like, I got you with what I said, and now you're beyond me. But I can piece some pieces together. And what I recognize is that we're trying to understand each other across that barrier of language. And so I'm stumbling through the English or the Spanish, and they're stumbling through the Spanish or the English to try to make sure that we understand each other and what I want. And that's Gary's idea, is that I might speak a different language of love than my spouse. And so if I'm speaking that language and my spouse doesn't know I'm speaking love, they just hear blah, blah, blah. They might not even notice that it's love. And if they're speaking theirs and I don't see it, that's not my love language, it's not my native tongue, I hear blah, blah, blah. And so there can be a lot of blah, 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 where both people are going, man, I'm doing all the loving in this relationship and I'm giving everything I can. And the other is hearing blah, 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 blah. And so Gary Chapman's idea is that these 5 love languages, and here we go, out on a limb to see if I can do it. Acts of service, words of affirmation, quality time, gifts, and touch are the 5 love languages. Mm-hmm. And the danger is when we hear touch, we go, oh, sex. But it's not. In fact, that's one of the big differentials he would say is sex is not a love language. It's a way of expressing love and enjoying each other. And it does have some touch to it. But a lot of times when you hear a lot from when I'm talking about love languages, men will go, oh, I'm touch. And being a guy who really is touch, I then question him a little further. Is it touch or is it sex that you're talking about? You have this desire for sex, and it's not really touch, because touch is hold my hand, pat my back. Any touch, it doesn't have to be sex, feeds love. If somebody can have sex and still feel unloved, it's not about touch. There's something else that's missing. And so Gary Chapman talks about filling up your spouse's love tank, figuring out their love language and filling it up. And so that certainly helps when you're going through challenges, that you both are trying to speak the other person's love language, and you're also trying to see that your spouse is saying, I love you, through their love language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that book just really kind of, because I like the language analogy, because whatever language you speak, so if your love language, say, is touch, and then you're always, caressing your partner all the time, and your partner's love language is, say, acts of service, then there's just this miscommunication going on that can lead to. So I really like that idea, and I think that it could be a helpful tool, for couples who are struggling. But I'm sure that you've seen the implications of applying those languages appropriately in your practice.
Yeah, and part of it is making sure that you've determined that, and there, Gary has some resources both on his websites and in his book about identifying those love languages. And then sometimes it's a little struggle because, if a couple is actually in trouble, the first thing you usually hide is your love language. If you no longer show your love through that way. And so sometimes the spouse is confused going, I don't see them doing anything. Well, maybe because they stopped doing it. Because they're, if the way I primarily show love is touch, and I'm angry and hurt and not feeling loving, I'm not going to touch. And so then that becomes invisible. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous place to be, because that probably means that your partner's love tank is empty, which is why they're not doing any showing it at all.
And that's, so one of the things that I actually have it on my blog, Gary and I came up with this 6-month experiment. Can you just say, you know what, I know I'm not going to get my love language spoken. I'm not going to even expect it. For 6 months, I'm going to show my spouse the love language, their love language. And I'm going to keep doing it. And sometimes it's amazing how you finally get to that. It's usually you're working from a deficit, so you're trying to get just to start to fill the tank. And the tank has to have a certain amount before the person starts filling it. But sometimes that's a good way of just suspending. I've got to get my love language and say, I'm going to fix this on my own. That's more of my kind of, it's not so much about infertility as much as my saving the marriage stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like from our conversation that you wouldn't look at just infertility. If a couple came into your office and they were struggling with infertility and they were saying to you that this is the reason why we're here and this is the reason why we're fighting, and if we weren't having the struggle, everything would be fine. It sounds like it's more to it than that, and it's really about the relationship as a whole and the perspective that the couple has really about their relationship.
Yeah, the only one I would add is just by the nature that the individual piece of that, the nature of infertility, is it can become the raison d'etre of the couple. This is it. This is what everything that they do is or at least one of them is focused all around that. And so that sometimes it gains its own momentum to it. And so, generally it's just that issue that's got them hooked. They didn't have the foundation that would lead them through it. But I also recognize that infertility has its own strength to it, its own power to it, that a couple has to also deal with those ins and outs that are unique to that. And I think whenever I hear somebody's become kind of a one cause wonder, they've got one issue in their life and that's completely defined them. I tend to think that that's an individual piece where they've kind of lost a more well-rounded approach and have become only that, and to their detriment, because they usually chosen something they have no control over. And then now this is bringing my other piece, then they're not able to thrive because they're out of balance with the rest of their life.
Okay. Well, and something kind of it's a question that it's something that you talk about on the show, but so, I'm in this place, my partner and I are not seeing eye to eye. I want to continue trying for a baby. My partner maybe doesn't. And so I come in to see you and I'm fine. It's my partner that's the problem.
Hmm.
And if my partner just fixed their attitude, everything would
Right.
be fine. So
Yeah.
what is your perspective on that type of ideology when it comes to relationships? It's all his fault. It's all her fault.
Yeah, and those are. It's always nice to be able to believe that it's always somebody else's fault completely, and usually there are exceptions, but usually that's not the case. There are two people involved in the relationship, and both people have a stake in the breakdown. So one of my other big things is thriving. I have another podcast, Thriveology, which is the art and science of thriving, where part of what I push people to do is to go, okay, what's my responsibility? Where am I responsible? And I define responsible by the ability to respond rather than just reacting. And where do I need to look at how I might be able to respond differently in any situation? And that begins to bring them back into the picture of how am I hooked into this too? How am I responding to this situation in ways that aren't quite so helpful for our relationship?
Okay. And is there a time when a couple should call it quits? I mean, we live in a world where, at the first sight of trouble, it's really, it's just not the same, I guess, as my parents' generation or the generation before, where you kind of stuck it out.
Yeah.
And that's not the only option either. It's not like you divorce or you stick it out painfully, angrily, um, and just like settle for not a happy relationship. But what would you say to, a couple that's really struggling and, either partner or both partners are questioning, like, is this worth it? It's so hard. Should it be this difficult? We're so different. When is it time to move on?
Yeah, there are different layers to what you just said. So let me tackle a couple of myths. One is we're just so different. All the dating sites use this compatibility thing, and yet none of the research in marriage shows that compatibility has anything to do with long-term success in a marriage. There are plenty of marriages where it is complete opposites that decide to bring their best selves. They create a bigger whole by balancing each other out. And so compatibility is usually is very shallow. So that's always a myth. The second is this should be easy. If there's something wrong, if it's hard. And I always go, where else do you see that? People go, school, this should be easy. If I was meant to go through school, it'd just be easy. I wouldn't have to study. I wouldn't have to work hard. Or you wanted to get into shape. And so you say, man, I shouldn't have to lift weights. If I was meant to have a six pack and big biceps, then it should just be there. Nobody believes it in anywhere but in a marriage. And then they go, oh, we're struggling. There's something hard here. Oh, it shouldn't be this hard. So we go our own separate ways. I always believe throughout life that there are three options. One is, and any of the three can have merit at times. But the first one is you suck it up and you stay where you are and things just kind of coast the way they are. A second option is to cut and run, have nothing to do with where you are, just leave it behind. And the third option is to say, okay, where I am, I just need to change where I am. I'm not going to be. So the first one is I just suck it up and live in a miserable relationship. That was probably the 40s and 50s, and you couldn't get divorced, so just live with it. The second one happened in the late 60s and 70s, where people said, not happy, I'm out of here. And now I'm watching some people go, wait a minute. there's got to be a third, and there always is a third option of going, I'm going to stay in the relationship and I'm going to make it something that I would want. So that third option is always available. And so I always draw one hard distinction on, let's say two, but one primary one, that people don't work on an abusive relationship. To me, if it's an abusive relationship, that's a no-go. If there's physical abuse, for sure. If there's a lot of emotional abuse, for pretty sure, but there are some exceptions to that because of boundaries that people can create and learn how to set their own boundaries. But let's just say that if it's an abusive relationship, time to not work on it. The other time is when there is a difference in core values. And I'm not talking about just general values. A lot of times people go, oh, values. Well, we disagree on politics. I'm talking about core values, like one person believes that you should be married to one person and the other person believes you should have 5 spouses or 2 spouses or 3 spouses. That kind of a difference in core values is irreconcilable. You can't do both ways. And so if one might believe in, say, polygamy, but never live it out, that's a different matter. But when I've had, and I say that because I've had the couples who come to me and say, my spouse wants to have another spouse, and I don't agree with that. Well, that's a no-go. Mm-hmm. But other than that, what I try to do is create the tools and the resources that people can use if they're choosing to work towards that being a we. And so I leave that to the individual to say, yeah, I want to work on this, and so I need the tools.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I have 3 actually final questions to wrap up the show. But before I ask you those, I wanted to ask you about that whole idea that, like you get into that place with your spouse that things aren't working, and you decide to go with the first option where I don't know what order it is, but the option I'm just going to cut and run because there's something wrong with my spouse, quote unquote, and I'm just going to find somebody who is better, who's more compatible. Yep. So why don't you talk about your perspective on that idea?
Well, I mean, there are a few problems to that. If it's an abusive relationship, I do think, time to cut and run. But what a lot of times people discover is they're not happy, or maybe very frequently somebody else has caught their eye and they're going, I would be happier there. And that's a big issue. And what they tend to fail to see is that we are creatures of habit. And we tend to create the same relationship all over again if we don't address it. If we don't figure out what went wrong, we do it again. And so I wish I had had fewer of these conversations in my career, but I've had people who would say, oh, I found this other person is completely different. They're nothing like my spouse is. They're completely different. And I figured it out. This is the person I really need. It's a completely different relationship. And I always ask a simple question. Are you comparing where your marriage is now to the beginnings of this relationship? Or are you comparing the beginnings of your relationship with your spouse with this one? And that usually is a very painful subject, because if they reflect back honestly, they often realize that they're having the same feelings that they did the first time, and they're stepping into the exact same relationship that they've already have been through once and hit a dead end. And so a lot of times the cut and run leaves us with a wound that hasn't been healed. And there are lots of the woundedness of that, if there are kids involved, the wounds of the kids, families are affected, individuals are affected, lifestyles are affected. I mean, there's a whole lot that happens in a divorce that's been whitewashed by our society that's very painful and very damaging to people psychologically, emotionally, financially, relationally. And they tend to make the same mistake again. So my feeling is, why not see if you can correct it, figure out the roots of this, and get it on track rather than just cutting and running and doing it again. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you focus on, it may be simple, but it's not easy. But then who said that it was supposed to be easy? Mm-hmm. Not that it should be like horrible every day,
Right.
But obviously, there are challenges to everything that's worth anything in
Hmm.
life.
Yeah.
So to tie up our show today, I have three final questions for you. So they might feel a bit broad, so we'll see how they go. But the first one, what would you say is the biggest myth about marriage that you would like to see corrected?
Um, oh gosh, myths. I can name several. Well, certainly a big one that I think gets in the way is that it should be easy. And that people don't realize the shift that happens. They just think that life is just kind of like going on the next step in, and they don't recognize that big shift. So I think somewhere in that world of the myth being nothing really changes about marriage, and that if it's hard, then something's wrong. Those certainly are my big ones.
Hmm. And what would you say is the biggest myth about divorce that you'd like to see corrected?
That it doesn't cause long-term damage. There was a book that came out that said, "Oh, kids do fine after divorce," and that research has been fairly disproven. And so the only times that I see successful divorces, and that's an odd term, but successful divorces, is that when it's two people who have very little intermingled in their life, and usually are fairly young and can say goodbye to each other and not see each other. And that doesn't mean there's no damage. It's just less damage because they don't have to, stay together. But the ones that I see are, we'll divorce and we'll be friends. That's a big, huge myth. You're breaking a bond that once you've created, you break it very painfully. And so I would say that the no fault, no pain divorce, that's the myth that drives me batty.
Hmm. And there's always the one random story of a couple who has this amazing relationship where they divorced and they live down the road and they share custody and everything's happy and great. But probably doesn't represent the majority
Yeah.
of the
Well, and
fact.
that, when I hear that, a couple of times I've met those people and several, let's say more than a couple of times, but when I've met them, sometimes what I've realized is they never psychologically divorced. They still have a relationship, and that relationship can go very deep. And
Mm.
so there's always those. Then there are those who really were so disconnected that when they finally divorced, it really was a matter of let's band together so that there's as little effect to the kids as possible. So there are those two. And then all the other cases where I hear about those, it's somebody who knew somebody who, had a successful divorce. It's kind of like the urban myth. Somebody who saw that, but you can't ever find that person.
Yeah. Well, final question of the day then, and back to our topic of infertility. What would you say, or what advice would you give to a couple who is struggling with fertility challenges and wants for their relationship to stay together, even though it's a challenging time for them?
Yeah. Expect that you're not going to be at the same place, the same time, but join together and be in it together and recognize that you both are going to have pains and you're both going to have protections of the other person. And both of those pieces are very valid points of this is too painful for me. I can't move forward. And this is too painful for you. I don't want us to move forward are very important conversation points. The biggest piece to do is to say, we need to be together on this. We need to be a team on this, not together in lockstep, but together in spirit. We join together to get through this issue.
Well, and I do apologize because now I have a follow-up question.
Oh, that's fine.
Because I said it was the last question.
No
I
problem.
know that you could talk about this topic for quite some time, but if just so that because I should have probably asked about it earlier. But many couples who are going through these challenges would then, of course, the next logical step is to go to therapy and to look at a counselor. So for a couple who's thinking about going that route, what, I guess, best practices for choosing a counselor who could best support them in their challenge?
Oh boy.
I know, I'm sorry.
Okay. No. It's a great question, but it's not a short answer. So let me try to talk through my concerns because my concerns then point to what do you do. I think that a big part of my concern about marital counseling is that there are a lot of marital counselors, and I put that in quotes, who have no training, no formal training as marital therapists. They don't see it systemically, which I think is very important. They don't see this as the interplay. So they're basically trying to do individual therapy with two people in their office. And when that happens, it's very hard to have two clients at the same time, because sometimes you're trying to, move to what somebody wants. And so I hear it very often that somebody goes to therapy and initially a spouse says, I don't want to work on it. And then that therapist is caught in a conflict of going, well, I'll just support that person who doesn't want it and help the other person through it because then they'll be fine. So my first concern about marital therapy is that a therapist is often not formally trained as a marital therapist. That's not their primary orientation. So therefore, you want to know, are you trained as a marital therapist? Not were you an individual therapist who noticed that you had some couples and so you claimed it and maybe you went into a weekend, and I'm saying this a bit facetiously, but you went to a weekend workshop and got your certificate, because there is not a formality to saying marital therapist. It's not a protected name. So that'd be my first thing is, are they truly oriented towards marital therapy? The second thing is that therapy has a long history of wanting to be value neutral. And so if an individual comes into my office, there's a lot of importance to me being value neutral, not bringing my values into the process. But I use the analogy in marital therapy. If somebody goes to marital therapy, they're wanting to make their marriage better. That's my assumption. And so to me, going to a therapist who is not pro-marriage means it's kind of like going to the doctor. You walk in and your arm's at a right angle from where it should be, and you put it up there, and they look at it and they go, yeah, your arm's broken. Now, what do you want to do about that? Did you want to leave it alone, or did you want us to do something about that? And we never would think that the doctor would be neutral about it. They're going to be there to fix that bone. And yet marital therapists sometimes are not pro-marriage in their approach. So the second question is, are you pro-marriage? Are you going to be working with our marriage as the patient, and you're there to fix that patient? And one of the things I always have people ask is, who's your client? And if they stumble around, that's probably not the best choice. If they say your relationship is my client, dead on, good person. How do you feel about marriage? Are you pro-marriage or neutral? You're not going to find any who say they're anti-marriage, but they may say that they are neutral. That concerns me. I want them to be working for the relationship. So the third piece is that a detriment to therapy is dragging a spouse in for therapy. There is a belief that somehow that therapist has some magic to make that person want to stay in the relationship. So even if you have a trained therapist, marital therapist, they are trained in marital therapy, they are pro-relationship, and then you drag in a resistant spouse, all that's going to happen is the spouse is going to get more resistant, not less. There's no magic to that. And so if a couple is going to therapy, I suggest that they are only ready to go to therapy when both people want to work on the relationship, and they're going to see somebody who is pro-marriage, and that person is trained to be working on a marriage.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I didn't actually plan to ask that, but then as soon as you talked about what to recommend for couples who are struggling, I figured someone's going to be thinking like, so do I go to therapy? So thank you for breaking that down, because I think that I had never really thought about that perspective until listening to your podcast, and it actually makes perfect sense. And a counselor probably wouldn't even think of themselves as in that terms if they hadn't really, actually had that conversation with themselves of who is my client. So, so thank you so much. Great words to end on. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Baucom.
Well, thank you for having me. Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, Lisa.
And so for our listeners who really enjoyed our conversation today and want to learn more about you and what you do, where would you direct them?
Oh, okay. So if they go, oh, I need some tools, savethemarriage.com is where I have the tool set, the system. So that's if they're ready. If they're going, okay, this was interesting, it was helpful, I would like to hear more. The shortcut is to go to Save the Marriage blog. That's blog, like a blog on the internet. So savethemarriageblog.com. That will put them on the backside of the website where I have my podcast, so they can find the podcast and subscribe and listen whatever they want to do. All the podcasts are there, are free. And then there is the one I mentioned a few minutes ago, Thriveology, which is THRIVEOLOGY.com, Thriveology.com. So if they're interested in how can I have a more thriving life, no matter what life's thrown my way, Thriveology.com. If they want to hear some more marital therapy, or not therapy, because I've actually moved away from that to marital coaching, to relationship coaching, but more about that, go to savethemarriageblog.com. And then if they're ready for some tools, savethemarriage.com.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you again. It was a great conversation. It was lovely having a chance to speak with you. It's always interesting to speak with someone who you kind of feel like because I listen to your podcast. So
thanks for reaching out.
All right. Well, have a great day.
Thank you too.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/80. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please do look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. And make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com and join my mailing list. If you have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, shoot me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. And remember, you don't have to figure it all out yourself. I absolutely love helping women to connect with their cycles, and I can't wait to delve in with you and help you bring your cycles back to health. Get started today with a free 15-minute consultation with me by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/coaching, or just click the Work With Me button on my website. Thanks again for hanging out with me today. I appreciate all of you for taking the time to tune into the podcast, whether you're on the go, commuting to go to work. Thank you so much for letting me be part of your day. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.